Hey there. I'm going to talk today about Russia's foreign relations. I'm also going to cover the subsection of the current events part of your textbook that talks about Russia's relationship with Central Asia. One heads up, I think probably the most important development in Russian foreign relations in the last decade has been the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. Depending which edition of the textbook you have, your textbook might or might not talk about that in some degree of detail. I have a different video, which is linked in the description here, specifically dealing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. I recommend that you watch that. And if you're in my class, I have probably assigned it to you. So please check whatever documents it is where I tell you to do your homework. Okay, so let's start with a really common trope in discussions of Russia's post 1991 foreign relations, and that is this idea that Russia is in kind of a constant struggle for power and influence with the West. I have put scare quotes around that phrase because I think it's a little bit lazy to describe the West as like a single unified entity, but it's really commonly used as shorthands for democratic capitalist countries that were generally allied with the United States during the Cold War. And the Cold War is really the relevant political context here, in case you have somehow escaped knowledge of this in the entire course of your history education. Between the end of World War II in 1945 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the US and the Soviet Union are locked in this not directly violent but very heated conflict for global power and influence in terms of ideology, in terms of economic influence, in terms of political influence, that's going to last for those 45 plus years. And it's worth noting, by the way, that the United States is going to form a number of military alliances, the most important of which is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Soviets are going to form a military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact, which no longer exists. There are some periods during the Cold War where both sides do actually try to de escalate tensions, and notably under Gorbachev and then under Boris Yeltsin, the Soviets slash the Russians are more open to some degree of kind of rapprochement with the United States, to friendlier relations. In particular, in the early 90s, there's a great deal of hope in the United States as Yeltsin embarks on these policies of economic liberalization, that there is going to be, that Russia might turn into a country that the United States can work with, can cooperate with, can trade with, and so on and so forth. However, it turns out, particularly under Putin, that that's not true, that the United States and its allies have not forged a strong partnership with Russia and its allies where they're pursuing common foreign policy goals. And I'm going to spend a little time thinking about reasons why that's the case. Number one is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are two international organizations that have expanded into what Russians historically have viewed as their sphere of influence, particularly in Eastern Europe. Those are NATO, which is the Cold War era military alliance that's specifically designed, when it's first founded, to resist Soviet expansion and influence, and then the European Union, which isn't specifically anti-Russian, but which is kind of a competing power center. And so when former Soviet satellite states or former Soviet republics join NATO or join the European Union, which has happened in increasing numbers in the last couple of decades, many people in Russia view this as kind of a sign of their declining influence and a threat to their ability to have their way in Eastern Europe and in the Baltic. One specific historical incident which helps escalate tensions is that in the 1990s, there's some really complex sectarian wars which have religious and ethnic dimensions in the former Yugoslavia. As that country falls apart and different states try to carve out independence and favorable boundaries, Russia is more sympathetic to Serbia, which is a country that's mostly ethnically Slavic and religiously Orthodox. So Russians often think of Serbia as kind of worth protecting. If you know about the origins of the First World War, you've heard me say that before. But NATO ends up intervening on the side of Muslims in Bosnia and in Kosovo. And so that is one starting point, if you want to identify a starting point for post 1991 tensions. Then in the 2000s, the United States engages in a variety of international wars and nation building exercises. So in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. And this builds a perception among many Russian political elites that the United States is willing to run roughshod over other countries' sovereignty if it doesn't like the way that they have organized their political regimes. And you've also heard this criticism in Russia increasingly. that the United States is really deeply hypocritical for engaging in these kind of democracy building exercises abroad, particularly in the Middle East, while actually having an imperfect democracy at home. That's a fairly common message of Putin era propaganda. Finally, when Russia invades Ukraine in 2014, the United States and the European Union denounced this very strongly and imposed economic sanctions on Russia. And so that's an additional source of continued tension. And I'll just remind you again that I have a different video on this subject, which you should watch if you want to fully understand Russian relations. I'm not going to spend much time talking about Ukraine in this video because I have already done that elsewhere. So, given that it is not going to just kind of join NATO, join the EU, hold hands, sing kumbaya with the United States and its allies, how is Russia seeking to project power? Couple of ways. Number one, worth noting that Russia maintains really strong relationships with and a considerable degree of influence in a number of Central Asian countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, such as Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. These are countries that by and large have not democratized after the fall of the Soviet Union, and where the former Soviet elite, the nomenklatura, still retain a great deal of political power. Those countries are among Russia's strongest allies. Two international organizations help us understand how Vladimir Putin's government in particular is going to try and maintain those relationships and turn them into some degree of prosperity and power for Russia. One is called the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is an organization that incorporates Russia and most of the other former Soviet republics, although not 100% of them. This is a fairly loose organization, but it is kind of a vehicle for Putin to coordinate foreign policy with those states and to express kind of symbolic solidarity with those states. The other, and the one that has more potential for actual economic and political integration, is a smaller organization founded in 2015 called the Eurasian Economic Union. This is, or at least aspires to be, somewhat similar to the European Union in its eventual outlines. It's supposed to be a single market, so they have one external tariff barrier that's going to promote trade between Russia and the other member states. Eventually, there are some aspirations to have a common currency and a political union with greater freedom of movement. That's still in the works. But it is worth noting that this might reflect an attempt by Russia to try and to build its own international influence through integration with other countries. The Eurasian Economic Union has fewer member states than the EU right now. Other than Russia, the member states are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, and Armenia. So this has not necessarily been a smashingly successful project yet in terms of giving Russia a greater base of allies in order to project power. It's also worth noting, and yet for the last time, I think you should take a look at the other video that I have put up on YouTube about this. But when Ukraine decides not to join the Eurasian Economic Union in 2014, Russia had been pushing hard for Ukraine to do this, and ultimately, due to in part to public agitation in the other direction, Ukraine is instead going to opt to pursue closer integration with the European Union. This is a considerable blow to Russia's ambitions, and it's one of the factors that helps explain Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Last thing to note about Russia's foreign policy. In the last decade or so, Russia has increasingly engaged in the spread of disinformation and also in hacking and other cyber attacks outside of its borders. And this isn't new. Spreading propaganda, spreading disinformation is a characteristic tactic of the Soviet intelligence services. But rising popularity of the internet and social media for people acquiring political information has really increased the impact of these operations. So, for instance, you are probably aware that during the 2016 presidential campaign in the United States, hackers based in Russia got into the Democratic National Committee's email servers and released a number of compromising emails in a way that was perceived to help the Trump campaign. And of course, there was an entire impeachment trial about whether the Trump campaign had colluded with Russians in that effort. There's an organization that you've probably actually seen pop up on your social media called RT, that's Russia Today. They're pretty good at getting somewhat viral sort of news clips and videos out there on the internet. And this is a broadcasting network that operates in English that often spreads information or focuses on stories that will, to some degree, make the United States look bad. There's been other instances of hacks and malware and ransomware spread by groups based in Russia, targeting governments outside of Russia and private companies outside of Russia in the quote unquote West. I will leave it there. We will talk more about how all of these things tie into Putin's strategies for maintaining power domestically and abroad when I see you next in class. Thanks.